The rain pelted against the cracked windows of the tiny orphanage, a dreary reminder of the struggles within its walls. Inside, the laughter of children was faint and infrequent, drowned out by the groan of loose floorboards and the whistle of wind seeping through gaps in the walls. This was home to Eliza, a blind girl of 10 with an extraordinary gift and an unyielding spirit. Eliza's life had always been a mosaic of shadows and sound. Abandoned as an infant on the orphanage steps, she had no memory of her parents. The headmistress, Sister Agnes, often recounted the night she arrived, a basket, a thin blanket, and a note scrawled in hurried handwriting. Her name is Eliza. Please take care of her. That was all. From her earliest days, Eliza's world was one of touch and sound, her other senses compensating for what her sight could not offer. Though she couldn't see, Eliza's hands seemed to possess their own vision. It started when she was 5, the first time her fingers brushed the keys of an old, upright piano tucked in the corner of the orphanage's common room. It had been donated years earlier by a retired music teacher, long before Eliza's arrival. The instrument was more a relic than a tool, its surface marred by scratches and its keys uneven and discolored. But to Eliza, it was a treasure. The first notes she played were accidental, her tiny fingers pressing down as she felt the cool, smooth keys beneath her touch. But the sound that emerged, melancholy and resonant, ignited something deep within her. She began to play every chance she got, her hands moving across the keyboard with a grace that surprised even herself. While the other children spent their afternoons playing tag or dreaming of future families, Eliza remained at the piano, her ears attuned to every note, her small body swaying with the rhythm she conjured. At first, the other children teased her. "What's the blind girl doing with the piano?" one boy laughed. "She can't even see the keys." But their mockery turned to awe as her melodies grew more complex, more beautiful. By the time she was 7, her talent had captivated the orphanage. The children would gather around the piano after dinner, their eyes wide with wonder, as Eliza played lullabies that softened the harshness of their lives. Sister Agnes was the first to realize the depth of Eliza's gift. She had once taught music herself, and though her fingers were now too stiff to play, her ear was still sharp. "Eliza," she said one evening, her voice thick with emotion as she watched the girl play, "where did you learn this?" "I didn't," Eliza replied, her voice soft but confident. "I just feel it." Sister Agnes wiped a tear from her eye. She knew this gift was extraordinary, but the reality of their circumstances left little room to nurture it. The orphanage was falling apart. Peeling wallpaper, leaking ceilings, and an ever-dwindling supply of food. The government aid they received barely covered essentials, and donations were few and far between. Often, the children went to bed hungry, their stomachs grumbling louder than the creaks of the old building. The piano, Eliza's sanctuary, was also a victim of time and neglect. Several keys stuck, and others produced dull, muted tones. The pedals squeaked, and the wood emitted a faint smell of mildew. But Eliza didn't complain. She treated the instrument with reverence, as though it were a living thing that needed her care as much as she needed its music. Despite the struggles, the orphanage was a place of love and resilience. Sister Agnes and the handful of staff worked tirelessly to keep the children safe and hopeful. Yet, as the years passed, the challenges grew more daunting. Bills piled up, repairs went undone, and with each passing day the question loomed larger. How much longer could they keep the orphanage open? For Eliza, the answer came in the form of a simple, desperate plan. One day, as she played the piano in the common room, Sister Agnes approached with a thoughtful expression. "Eliza," she began, hesitating as if unsure how to proceed, "would you be willing to share your music with the world?" Eliza tilted her head, her unseeing eyes staring into the distance. "What do you mean, sister?" "There's a train station not far from here," Sister Agnes explained. "It's always busy, full of people rushing to and from the city. If you played there, perhaps people would listen. Perhaps they'd be moved to help us." The idea frightened Eliza at first. She had never ventured far from the orphanage, her world limited to its creaking walls and familiar voices. But the thought of helping the other children, of ensuring they had enough food, enough warmth, overcame her fear. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady with determination. The next morning, Eliza's routine began. Sister Agnes or one of the older children would guide her to the train station, her small hands clutching the fraying strap of her second-hand satchel. In it, she carried a jar for coins, a thermos of water, and a cloth to keep the piano keys clean. The station was overwhelming at first, a cacophony of voices, footsteps, and announcements that reverberated through the high ceilings. But once Eliza's fingers found the keys of the station's public piano, the chaos faded. Her music filled the air, cutting through the noise like sunlight through storm clouds. At first, few people noticed her. Commuters hurried past, their eyes glued to their phones or their minds preoccupied with the day ahead. But slowly, her music began to draw attention. A businessman paused mid-stride, his briefcase hanging at his side as he listened to her play a piece by Chopin. A young mother with a crying toddler stopped in her tracks, the child calming as the gentle notes washed over them. A street artist setting up his easel nearby nodded in appreciation, tipping his hat to the blind girl who played like she could see the very soul of the music. Coins began to clink into her jar, and by the end of the first week, Eliza had collected enough to buy a modest supply of groceries for the orphanage. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Each morning, she returned to the station, her confidence growing with each note she played. The regular commuters began to recognize her, some offering kind words, others simply nodding in silent acknowledgement of her talent. But not everyone was kind. Occasionally, a stranger would make a cruel remark, questioning whether her blindness was real or dismissing her as a beggar. Eliza learned to tune them out, focusing instead on the music and the faces of the kind-hearted strangers who stopped to listen. The piano itself was another challenge. Though it was in better condition than the one at the orphanage, it wasn't without its flaws. Several keys stuck, and the bench wobbled precariously. Yet, Eliza adapted, her fingers dancing over the keys with an instinctive grace that seemed to defy logic. One rainy afternoon, as Eliza played a particularly mournful melody, a young man approached her. He was dressed in a tattered coat, his face weary but kind. "That's beautiful," he said softly, dropping a handful of coins into her jar. "Do you know what you've got, kid?" Eliza paused, her hands resting on the keys. "What do you mean?" "You've got a gift," he said, crouching to her level. "A real gift. Don't let this world take it from you." His words lingered with her long after he walked away, mingling with the echoes of her music and the quiet hope that kept her going. Each evening, when Eliza returned to the orphanage, she would recount her day to the other children, describing the people she met and the melodies she played. Though she couldn't see their faces, she could feel their excitement, their shared pride in her small victories. But as the weeks turned into months, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. The coins she collected were never enough to meet the orphanage's needs, and Eliza couldn't ignore the exhaustion creeping into her body. Her fingers ached from hours of playing, and her back throbbed from sitting on the rickety bench. Yet, she pushed on, driven by the knowledge that her music was their lifeline. One evening, as she played a lullaby in the common room, Sister Agnes approached her with tears in her eyes. "Eliza," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given us more than we ever could have asked for." Eliza shook her head, her fingers never faltering on the keys. "It's not enough, sister. I have to do more." Sister Agnes placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You've already done more than enough, my dear. The rest, we'll find a way." Eliza nodded, though her heart ached with the weight of unspoken fears. She knew the orphanage's survival was tenuous, their future as fragile as the melodies she played each day. But in the quiet moments, when the world faded and only the music remained, she felt a glimmer of hope that one day her gift might be enough to change everything. The train station was alive with its usual chaos. Travelers hurried in every direction, clutching briefcases, luggage, and coffee cups as they navigated the labyrinth of platforms. Overhead, announcements blared, barely discernible over the hum of conversations and the rhythmic clatter of train wheels. It was a space where no one lingered, a thoroughfare for those moving too fast to take in the world around them. Victor Harrington stood near the entrance, detached from the bustle. His sharp suit and polished leather shoes set him apart from the everyday commuters. His steel-gray hair was perfectly combed back, and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist. Everything about him radiated power, precision, and control. But his face, angular and cold, betrayed little emotion. Victor was here for business. The train station wasn't a place he frequented by choice, but the old buildings surrounding it had caught the attention of his real estate firm. They were relics of a bygone era, quaint brick structures with arched windows and peeling paint. Victor saw them not as symbols of history, but as prime real estate for high-rise development. The deal was nearly finalized, and he had come to inspect the area personally before his team moved forward. He adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the station, with the sharpness of a predator surveying its prey. The thought of transforming this crowded, noisy space into a sleek commercial hub brought a rare flicker of satisfaction to his otherwise stoic demeanor. But his moment of satisfaction was interrupted by a sound, a melody soft and haunting, rising above the chaos. Victor froze. The notes floated through the air, delicate yet powerful, each one resonating with an unexpected clarity. The melody was unassuming at first, a gentle lullaby, but it quickly evolved into something richer, more profound. The sound wasn't just music, it was emotion distilled into sound, carrying a weight that Victor couldn't ignore. He turned his head, searching for the source. Amid the sea of commuters, he spotted a girl seated at a worn-out piano near the center of the station. Her small hands danced across the keys with an elegance that seemed out of place in such a gritty setting. She was blind. He could tell by the way her unseeing eyes stared straight ahead, her head tilted slightly as though she were listening to something far away. Victor's first instinct was curiosity, then confusion. Why was he so captivated? He had no patience for street performers, often dismissing them as distractions or nuisances. Yet, he couldn't look away. There was something achingly familiar about the music, something that stirred a part of him he had buried long ago. The melody shifted, becoming slower, almost melancholic. It reminded Victor of Sunday mornings from his childhood, when his mother used to play the piano in their modest home. She had been his anchor in a turbulent world, her music a refuge from the harshness of his father's expectations. But that was a lifetime ago, in a version of himself he had long since discarded. Victor clenched his jaw and forced himself to look away. He didn't come here for sentimentality. He came for business. But as he started to walk toward the exit, the music tugged at him again, each note like a thread unraveling the armor he had spent decades building. Against his better judgment, he turned back and approached the girl. She was smaller than he had realized, her frame almost swallowed by the oversized bench. Her clothes were plain, her hair tied back in a simple braid. A jar sat beside her on the floor, half filled with coins and crumpled bills. Yet, despite her humble appearance, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, her fingers moving across the keys as though she were commanding an orchestra. Victor stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. He prided himself on being a man of action, but this girl and her music had disarmed him in a way he couldn't explain. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firmer than he intended. The girl's hands paused on the keys, and she turned her head slightly in his direction. "Yes?" Victor hesitated. Up close, she looked even younger, perhaps 10 or 11, though her expression carried a maturity far beyond her years. "That piece you were playing," he said, his voice softening. "What is it?" "It's my own," she replied. "I made it up." Her words caught him off guard. Composing something so intricate at her age and without sight, it seemed impossible. "You wrote that?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. "Music is something I feel. It's like telling a story without words." Victor nodded, though he wasn't sure why. He had no reason to be standing here, speaking to this girl, yet he felt compelled to stay. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza," she said. "What's yours?" Victor hesitated, then answered. "Victor?" There was a pause, the noise of the station filling the space between them. Victor glanced at the jar by her side, noting the paltry amount inside. "Why are you playing here, Eliza?" "I'm raising money for the orphanage where I live," she said simply. "We don't have enough to keep going. The roof leaks, and there's not always enough food, so I come here to help." Her words were matter of fact, devoid of self-pity, but they hit Victor like a punch to the gut. He studied her face, searching for any sign of a pretense or manipulation, but there was none. She was genuine, innocent, and entirely out of place in his world of transactions and power plays. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "About a year," she said. "Every morning before school. and on weekends too. Victor glanced around the station, taking in the indifference of the crowd passing by. How many people had walked past her, oblivious to the talent and determination sitting before them? He felt a flicker of anger, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't his concern. He had no connection to this girl or her plight, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. "You said you live in an orphanage," he said. "Do you have anyone helping you?" "The sisters who run it," Eliza replied, "and the other kids. They're my family." Her words stirred something in him, an uncomfortable memory he had spent years trying to forget. Family. The word felt foreign to him now, stripped of the warmth it once held. His own family had been fractured long ago, broken by loss and ambition. He had distanced himself from it all, burying his pain beneath layers of success. But now, standing here, he felt those old wounds reopening. "I don't mean to be rude, but why are you asking me all these questions?" Eliza said, tilting her head curiously. "Most people just listen and leave." Victor blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose I'm curious. You're different." Eliza smiled, a faint but genuine expression. "Thank you," she said. "I think—" Victor glanced at the piano, noting its worn keys and scratched surface. It was clear it had seen better days, yet it still produced music that could silence a bustling train station. "Do you always play on this piano?" "Yes," Eliza said. "It's not as nice as the one at the orphanage, but it works." Victor raised an eyebrow. "The one at the orphanage is nicer?" Eliza laughed softly. "Not really. It's even older than this one, but it's special to me." Victor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and extracted a crisp $100 bill. He dropped it into the jar, the sound of the paper settling against the coins drawing Eliza's attention. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "That's very generous." Victor shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing," he said. "You deserve it." He turned to leave, but something made him pause. He glanced back at Eliza, who had already returned her hands to the keys, her fingers poised to play. For a moment, he considered asking more, about her life, her dreams, her future, but he stopped himself. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's lives. He had built his empire by staying detached, by keeping his focus on the bottom line. This girl and her music were a distraction, nothing more. Yet, as he walked away, the melody she played followed him, lingering in his mind long after he left the station. It was a sound he couldn't shake, a reminder of something he had lost and didn't know how to reclaim. For the first time in years, Victor Harrington felt a crack in the armor he had worked so hard to build. Victor sat in his office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The world below him was one he had built, a testament to decades of ambition, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. Yet, for all his accomplishments, for all the power and wealth he had amassed, he found himself haunted by the sound of a piano. Eliza's music had followed him like a ghost, its melody weaving through his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. He had tried to dismiss it, to focus on the mountain of deals and contracts that demanded his attention, but the girl's face and her quiet determination had etched themselves into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her, something just out of reach.
Frustrated, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. The voice on the other end answered immediately, crisp and professional. "Mr. Harrington," the man said. "What can I do for you?"
Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. "I need you to look into someone," he said. "A girl named Eliza. She plays piano at the train station near Riverton Plaza. Find out everything you can about her, where she's from, who her parents are, what her story is, and I want a full report by the end of the week." There was a brief pause before the investigator responded. "Understood. I'll get started right away." Victor ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of his decision settling over him. He told himself it was just curiosity, a need to satisfy his lingering questions so he could move on. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about Eliza had stirred a part of him he thought he had buried long ago, a part that still cared, still felt, despite his efforts to convince himself otherwise. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. Victor buried himself in work, but his mind kept drifting back to the train station, to the way Eliza's fingers had moved across the keys with such effortless grace. He found himself imagining her life, the struggles she must have faced, the resilience it must have taken to keep going. He hated how much he cared, how much her story had wormed its way under his skin, and yet he couldn't deny the pull it had on him. When the investigator finally called, Victor's heart raced in a way he hadn't felt in years. He answered the phone with his usual calm demeanor, but his voice betrayed a hint of tension. "What did you find?" he asked. The investigator's tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Victor immediately picked up on. "It's a complicated story, Mr. Harrington," he said. "Eliza is an orphan, as you know. She's been living at St. Mary's Orphanage since she was a baby, but there's more to it than that." Victor's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on," he said, his voice cold and steady. The investigator hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Her father's name was Daniel Harrington. Your brother." The words hit Victor like a freight train. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Memories flooded his mind, Daniel's laughter, his reckless charm, the way he had always looked up to Victor despite their differences. They had been close once, before the accident, before everything fell apart. Victor had tried to forget, to erase the pain of losing his brother by throwing himself into his work, but now the past was staring him in the face, refusing to be ignored. "Are you certain?" Victor said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the investigator replied. "I cross-referenced the records. Eliza's mother, Claire, was married to Daniel. She passed away a few years after the accident. Before she died, she reached out to the Harrington family for help, but—" Victor's stomach churned as the investigator's words trailed off. He didn't need to hear the rest to know what had happened. Claire's plea for help must have come during one of the most ruthless periods of his life, when he was too consumed by his ambition to care about anything else. He had likely dismissed her as just another distraction, another problem to be solved with money or ignored altogether. And now, Eliza was paying the price for his indifference. Victor ended the call and sat in silence, his mind racing. The guilt was overwhelming, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He had spent years convincing himself that he had done everything he could for his family, that his success was the best way to honor Daniel's memory. But now, faced with the truth, he realized how wrong he had been. He had abandoned his brother's family when they needed him most, and Eliza had grown up without the support she deserved. The days that followed were a blur of regret and self-recrimination. Victor couldn't stop thinking about Eliza, about the life she had been forced to live because of his actions, or lack thereof. He replayed their conversation at the train station over and over in his mind, her quiet strength and resilience only amplifying his shame. He wanted to make it right, to help her in some way, but he didn't know where to begin. He wasn't the kind of man who dealt in emotions or relationships. He dealt in contracts and transactions, in power and control. How could he possibly approach a child, his niece, after everything he had done? Victor's first instinct was to throw money at the problem. He contacted the orphanage and made a substantial donation, enough to cover their expenses for years to come. He arranged for repairs to the building, for new furniture and supplies, for anything they might need. But as satisfying as it was to know that Eliza and the other children would no longer have to struggle, it didn't feel like enough. Money couldn't erase the years of hardship she had endured, or the pain of losing her parents. It couldn't give her the family she had lost. Victor wrestled with his guilt, torn between his desire to help and his fear of rejection. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping others at arm's length. The idea of opening himself up, of admitting his mistakes, was terrifying. But every time he thought about walking away, about leaving Eliza to her own devices, the image of her playing that old piano at the train station stopped him. She deserved better than that. She deserved a chance to know the truth, to decide for herself whether she wanted him in her life. Finally, after days of deliberation, Victor made his decision. He would go to the train station and speak to her, not as a businessman or a benefactor, but as her uncle. It was a risk, a leap into unfamiliar territory, but it was the only way he could begin to make amends. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he hadn't felt in years. But as much as it unnerved him, it also reminded him that he was human, that that he still cared, despite everything. When Victor arrived at the train station, Eliza was already there, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys of the worn piano. The melody she played was different this time, lighter and more hopeful, but it still carried that same emotional depth that had drawn him in before. He watched her from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. How could he approach her? What could he possibly say to make her understand? As he stepped closer, Eliza paused in her playing, her head tilting slightly as if sensing his presence. "Hello," she said, her voice calm and steady. Victor hesitated, then forced himself to speak. "Hello, Eliza, it's Victor. We met the other day." "I remember," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're the man who asked about my music." "That's right," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I was wondering if we could talk." Eliza nodded, her hands resting gently on the keys. "What about?" Victor took a deep breath, the weight of his guilt and uncertainty pressing down on him. "It's complicated," he said, "but I think it's important. Do you have a moment?" Eliza tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face. "I suppose. What is it?" Victor sat down on the bench beside her, his heart racing as he prepared to tell her the truth. He didn't know how she would react, whether she would accept him or reject him, but he knew he had to try, for Daniel, for Claire, for Eliza, for himself. Victor sat in his office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The world below him was one he had built, a testament to decades of ambition, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. Yet for all his accomplishments, for all the power and wealth he had amassed, he found himself haunted by the sound of a piano. Eliza's music had followed him like a ghost, its melody weaving through his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. He had tried to dismiss it, to focus on the mountain of deals and contracts that demanded his attention, but the girl's face and her quiet determination had etched themselves into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her, something just out of reach. Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. "I need you to look into someone," he said. "A girl named Eliza. She plays piano at the train station near Riverton Plaza. Find out everything you can about her, where she's from, who her parents are, what her story is. I want a full report by the end of the week." There was a brief pause before the investigator responded. "Understood. I'll get started right away." Victor ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of his decision settling over him. He told himself it was just curiosity, a need to satisfy his lingering questions so he could move on. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about Eliza had stirred a part of him he thought he had buried long ago, a part that still cared, still felt, despite his efforts to convince himself otherwise. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. Victor buried himself in work, but his mind kept drifting back to the train station, to the way Eliza's fingers had moved across the keys with such effortless grace. He found himself imagining her life, the struggles she must have faced, the resilience it must have taken to keep going. He hated how much he cared, how much her story had wormed its way under his skin, and yet he couldn't deny the pull it had on him. When the investigator finally called, Victor's heart raced in a way he hadn't felt in years. He answered the phone with his usual calm demeanor, but his voice betrayed a hint of tension. "What did you find?" he asked. The investigator's tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Victor immediately picked up on. "It's a complicated story, Mr. Harrington," he said. "Eliza is an orphan, as you know. She's been living at St. Mary's Orphanage since she was a baby, but there's more to it than that." Victor's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on," he said, his voice cold and steady. The investigator hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Her father's name was Daniel Harrington. Your brother." The words hit Victor like a freight train. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Memories flooded his mind. Daniel's laughter, his reckless charm, the way he had always looked up to Victor despite their differences. They had been close once, before the accident, before everything fell apart. Victor had tried to forget, to erase the pain of losing his brother by throwing himself into his work. But now, the past was staring him in the face, refusing to be ignored. "Are you certain?" Victor said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the investigator replied. I cross-referenced the records. Eliza's mother, Claire, was married to Daniel. She passed away a few years after the accident. Before she died, she reached out to the Harrington family for help, but Victor's stomach churned as the investigator's words trailed off. He didn't need to hear the rest to know what had happened. Claire's plea for help must have come during one of the most ruthless periods of his life, when he was too consumed by his ambition to care about anything else. He had likely dismissed her as just another distraction, another problem to be solved with money or ignored altogether. And now, Eliza was paying the price for his indifference. Victor ended the call and sat in silence, his mind racing. The guilt was overwhelming, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He had spent years convincing himself that he had done everything he could for his family, that his success was the best way to honor Daniel's memory. But now, faced with the truth, he realized how wrong he had been. He had abandoned his brother's family when they needed him most, and Eliza had grown up without the support she deserved. The days that followed were a blur of regret and self-recrimination. Victor couldn't stop thinking about Eliza, about the life she had been forced to live because of his actions, or lack thereof. He replayed their conversation at the train station over and over in his mind, her quiet strength and resilience only amplifying his shame. He wanted to make it right, to help her in some way, but he didn't know where to begin. He wasn't the kind of man who dealt in emotions or relationships. He dealt in contracts and transactions, in power and control. How could he possibly approach a child, his niece, after everything he had done? Victor's first instinct was to throw money at the problem. He contacted the orphanage and made a substantial donation, enough to cover their expenses for years to come. He arranged for repairs to the building, for new furniture and supplies, for anything they might need. But as satisfying as it was to know that Eliza and the other children would no longer have to struggle, it didn't feel like enough. Money couldn't erase the years of hardship she had endured, or the pain of losing her parents. It couldn't give her the family she had lost. Victor wrestled with his guilt, torn between his desire to help and his fear of rejection. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping others at arm's length. The idea of opening himself up, of admitting his mistakes, was terrifying. But every time he thought about walking away, about leaving Eliza to her own devices, the image of her playing that old piano at the train station stopped him. She deserved better than that. She deserved a chance to know the truth, to decide for herself whether she wanted him in her life. Finally, after days of deliberation, Victor made his decision. He would go to the train station and speak to her, not as a businessman or a benefactor, but as her uncle. It was a risk, a leap into unfamiliar territory. But it was the only way he could begin to make amends. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he hadn't felt in years. But as much as it unnerved him, it also reminded him that he was human, that he still cared, despite everything. When Victor arrived at the train station, Eliza was already there, her fingers moving gracefully across the keys of the worn piano. The melody she played was different this time, lighter and more hopeful, but it still carried that same emotional depth that had drawn him in before. He watched her from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. How could he approach her? What could he possibly say to make her understand? As he stepped closer, Eliza paused in her playing, her head tilting slightly as if sensing his presence. "Hello?" she said, her voice calm and steady. Victor hesitated, then forced himself to speak. "Hello, Eliza. It's Victor. We met the other day." "I remember," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're the man who asked about my music." "That's right," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I was wondering if we could talk." Eliza nodded, her hands resting gently on the keys. "What about?" Victor took a deep breath, the weight of his guilt and uncertainty pressing down on him. "It's complicated," he said, "but I think it's important. Do you have a moment?" Eliza tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face. "I suppose. What is it?" Victor sat down on the bench beside her, his heart racing as he prepared to tell her the truth. He didn't know how she would react, whether she would accept him or reject him, but he knew he had to try. For Daniel, for Claire, for Eliza, for himself. Victor Harrington was not a man who made decisions lightly. When he left the train station that day, he knew he couldn't confront Eliza with the truth. Not yet. The revelation of her connection to him was a fragile thing, fraught with risks. What would she think of him? How could he expect her to accept help from someone who had failed her family so profoundly in the past? The stakes were too high to act recklessly, so Victor did what he did best. He made a plan. The first step was ensuring Eliza and the orphanage were no longer in jeopardy. Victor arranged a meeting with his financial advisor, instructing him to create an anonymous charitable fund dedicated to St. Mary's Orphanage. The donation was generous enough to cover the cost of urgent repairs, provide adequate food and supplies, and give the staff the resources they needed to create a safer, more nurturing environment. He didn't stop there. Victor hired a contractor to repair the orphanage's crumbling roof and windows, insisting on speed and quality. Within weeks, the building no longer resembled the rundown structure it had been. To ensure his identity remained concealed, all communications were funneled through a private intermediary. But money alone wasn't enough. Victor had seen Eliza's potential, the extraordinary gift she had, and he wanted her to have every opportunity to develop it. Using his network of contacts, he reached out to the most reputable music teachers in the city. After vetting several candidates, he found one who specialized in working with prodigious young pianists. A few quiet arrangements later, the tutor, a woman named Gabrielle Marchand, was hired to visit the orphanage twice a week and teach Eliza. Gabrielle was as captivated by Eliza's talent as Victor had been. From their first session, she recognized the raw brilliance in the girl's playing. "You have a natural instinct," Gabrielle told Eliza, her voice filled with awe. "Your touch, your phrasing, it's remarkable. But we'll need to work on structure and discipline if you want to reach your full potential." Eliza, for her part, embraced the lessons with a fervor that surprised even Gabrielle. She practiced tirelessly, often staying up late into the night to perfect the pieces Gabrielle assigned her. The children at the orphanage gathered around during her practice sessions, watching in silent admiration as her music filled the room. For the first time, Eliza felt like her gift was more than a way to survive. It was a path to something greater. As the weeks turned into months, Eliza's progress was astounding. Gabrielle introduced her to more complex compositions, challenging her with works by Chopin, Beethoven, and Debussy. Eliza tackled each piece with determination, her fingers flying over the keys with increasing confidence and precision. Word of her talent began to spread, and Gabrielle, seeing her students' potential, submitted an application on Eliza's behalf to the city's most prestigious music competition for young pianists. When Eliza received the acceptance letter, she was stunned. "Me?" she said, holding the letter in her trembling hands. "They want me to compete?" "Of course they do," Gabrielle said with a smile. "You've earned this, Eliza. You're ready." The news spread quickly through the orphanage, filling the children and staff with excitement. Sister Agnes wept tears of joy when she heard, clasping Eliza's hands in her own. "You've made us so proud," she said, her voice trembling. "No matter what happens, remember that." But as the competition approached, the weight of expectation began to press down on Eliza. She practiced harder than ever, determined not to disappoint Gabrielle, the orphanage, or herself. The sessions grew longer and more grueling, and she often skipped meals or stayed awake late into the night, driven by a relentless need to succeed. Gabrielle noticed the strain in her young student, but didn't press her, assuming it was simply pre-performance nerves. Victor, watching from a distance, was both proud and uneasy. He had been keeping tabs on Eliza's progress through Gabrielle and the orphanage staff, and while he was pleased with her development, he couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on her. He considered stepping in, urging her to rest, but he knew he couldn't do so without revealing his involvement. Instead, he silently hoped she would find her balance. The day of the competition arrived, and the auditorium was packed with an audience of music enthusiasts, judges, and families. Eliza sat backstage, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart raced as she listened to the other performers, their music drifting through the heavy velvet curtains. She clutched the small, worn charm Sister Agnes had given her that morning, a silver cross that had belonged to her mother. "She would be so proud of you," Sister Agnes had said, tears in her eyes. When Eliza's name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, and though she couldn't see the audience, She could feel their presence, the weight of their expectations. She sat down at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the keys as she steadied herself. Then, she began to play. The piece she had chosen was challenging, a showpiece that required both technical mastery and emotional depth. As her fingers moved across the keys, the audience was enraptured. The music was more than a performance. It was a story, one that seemed to echo with the struggles and triumphs of Eliza's life. Each note resonated with a clarity and emotion that left the room spellbound. Victor sat in the back of the auditorium, his heart pounding as he listened. He had never attended a music competition before, had never cared much for classical piano, but Eliza's performance left him breathless. In that moment, he saw not just her talent, but her strength, her determination to rise above the circumstances life had dealt her. She wasn't just playing for herself, she was playing for everyone who had ever believed in her. As the final note faded into silence, the audience erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Eliza sat frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the response, before rising from the bench and bowing. The applause grew louder, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. But as she turned to leave the stage, her vision swam, and a wave of dizziness swept over her. She stumbled, clutching the edge of the piano for support before collapsing onto the floor. The audience gasped, and Gabrielle rushed onto the stage, her face pale with worry. Victor stood as well, his chest tightening as panic gripped him. Eliza was taken backstage, where a medic examined her. "She's exhausted," the medic said. "She's been pushing herself too hard. She needs rest and proper nutrition." Gabrielle knelt beside Eliza, her voice gentle but firm. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" "I didn't want to let anyone down," Eliza said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to make everyone proud." Gabrielle's heart broke at the words, and she hugged her tightly. "You've already made us proud," she said. "But you can't pour from an empty cup, Eliza. You need to take care of yourself." Victor stood just outside the room, listening to the conversation. His heart ached with guilt. He had wanted to help her, to give her the opportunities she deserved, but he hadn't considered the pressure it would put on her. He realized he had been trying to make amends for his own failures without truly thinking about what Eliza needed. The competition organizers announced that Eliza had won first place, but the news barely registered with her. She was too weak, too drained to celebrate. As Gabrielle took her home to rest, Victor made a decision. It was time to step out of the shadows and tell her the truth. She deserved to know who he was, why he had been helping her, and what he planned to do next. For the first time in years, Victor Harrington resolved to face his past head-on, no matter the cost. Victor stood outside Eliza's hospital room, staring at the door with uncharacteristic hesitation. His whole life, he had commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and faced down rivals without blinking. Yet here he was, paralyzed by the thought of speaking to a 10-year-old girl. She wasn't just a child, though. She was family. His family. And Victor Harrington had never been good at family. Through the small window in the door, he could see her sitting up in bed. She looked so small, almost lost amidst the sterile white sheets and blinking monitors. Gabrielle sat beside her, holding her hand and speaking in soft tones. Eliza's expression was distant, as though her mind was far away. Victor knew that she must be processing the events of the competition, the exhaustion that had brought her to this point. But he also knew this moment couldn't wait any longer. She needed to know the truth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed the door open. Gabrielle looked up first, her brows furrowing slightly, but she didn't speak. Eliza turned her head toward the sound of his footsteps, her blind eyes wide with curiosity. "Victor?" she asked, her voice faint but steady. "What are you doing here?" Victor cleared his throat, his usual composure faltering. "I came to see how you're feeling," he said, his tone softer than usual. He glanced at Gabrielle, who hesitated for a moment before standing. "I'll step outside," she said, giving Victor a pointed look that seemed to say, "Don't mess this up." When the door clicked shut behind her, Victor pulled up a chair and sat beside Eliza's bed. For a moment, he simply looked at her, the words he had rehearsed over and over dissolving in the presence of her quiet strength. Finally, he spoke. "Eliza, there's something I need to tell you, Something I should have told you a long time ago." Eliza tilted her head, her expression cautious. "What is it?" Victor's hands clasped tightly in his lap as he struggled to find the right words. "The reason I've been helping you, the reason I've been so interested in your music, is because you're my niece. Your father, Daniel, was my brother." The room fell silent. For a moment, Eliza didn't react, her face blank as she processed his words. Then slowly, her brows knitted together. "My father?" she whispered. "You knew him?" Victor nodded, his throat tightening. "We grew up together. He was my younger brother. He was a good man, kind, talented, full of life. He paused, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I should have done more for him, for your mother. When they needed help, I wasn't there. I let them down. And because of that, you've had to grow up without them." Eliza's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Her small hands gripped the blanket tightly, her knuckles white. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "Why now?" Victor's chest ached at the question. "Because I was selfish," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I was so focused on my own life, my own success, that I shut out everything else. It wasn't until I saw you at the train station that I realized how much I'd failed you. I didn't know who you were then. But your music, it reminded me of Daniel. It made me want to know you. And when I found out the truth, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore." Eliza turned her face away, her expression unreadable. Victor's heart sank. He had prepared for anger, for tears, for rejection. But the silence was worse than anything he had imagined. "I understand if you hate me," he said quietly. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I want to make it right. I want to be here for you, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Eliza didn't respond. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, each sound stretching the silence further. Finally, she turned back toward him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can hate you," she said softly, "but I don't know if I can forgive you either. Not yet." Victor nodded, his throat tight. "That's fair," he said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." The days that followed were tentative but transformative. Victor visited the hospital daily, bringing books and small gifts to Eliza, though he never stayed too long. He sensed she needed space, and he didn't want to overwhelm her. Slowly, she began to open up, asking him questions about her parents, about his life, about the world outside the orphanage. Victor answered as honestly as he could, sharing stories about Daniel's mischievous streak and Claire's gentle spirit. He felt the walls between them start to crumble, brick by brick. When Eliza was well enough to leave the hospital, Victor made arrangements for her to have everything she needed. He ensured the orphanage was equipped with new supplies, better food, and even a refurbished piano for Eliza to practice on. But he also began spending more time with her outside the orphanage, taking her to concerts, museums, and music workshops. He wanted her to experience the world beyond the train station and to know she was capable of achieving anything. Despite his efforts, there were moments of tension. Eliza struggled to reconcile the man, who now seemed so invested in her life, with the one who had ignored her parents' pleas for help. Victor, for his part, wrestled with his own guilt, constantly questioning whether he was doing enough to make up for his past mistakes. But through it all, they continued to build a fragile but growing bond. The turning point came one afternoon when Victor brought Eliza to his office. She had been curious about his work, and he wanted her to see the world he had built. As they walked through the sleek glass-walled building, Eliza held tightly to his arm, her face a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. When they reached his office, Victor led her to the grand piano that sat near the window, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. "I had it brought in for you," he said. "I thought you might like to play." Eliza hesitated, running her fingers over the smooth keys. Then she sat down and began to play. The melody she chose was one Victor hadn't heard before, soft, hesitant, but undeniably beautiful. He stood by the window, listening, his chest tightening with emotion. When she finished, she turned toward him, her expression unreadable. I think I'd like to know more about you," she said. "About us." Victor smiled, his eyes misting. "I'd like that too." From that day forward, their relationship deepened. Victor became a father figure to Eliza, guiding her through the complexities of her newfound fame and supporting her as she continued to grow as a musician. He attended every recital, every competition, his pride evident in the way he spoke about her to anyone who would listen. And though their journey was far from perfect, it was filled with moments of connection, laughter, and healing. For the first time in years, Victor felt a sense of purpose beyond his work. Eliza, in turn, found the family she had always longed for. Together, they began to rewrite their story, not as strangers bound by guilt and regret, but as family united by love and hope for the future. Years passed, and the once cold and unyielding Victor Harrington became a man transformed. Eliza's presence in his life had reshaped him in ways he never thought possible. She had opened his eyes not only to his own failings, but also to the potential for good he held within him. For every night he spent listening to her music or sharing stories about her parents, Victor found himself wanting to do more, not just for Eliza, but for children like her who were brimming with potential yet stifled by circumstances beyond their control. It was during one of their quiet evenings together, with Eliza playing softly on the grand piano in his home, that the idea struck him. He could never undo the past, never erase the pain he had caused by turning his back on his family. But perhaps he could ensure no other child would face the struggles Eliza had endured. The Harrington Foundation was born that night, a vision crystallizing in Victor's mind as he watched his niece's delicate fingers move over the keys. It would be a beacon for underprivileged children with extraordinary talent, providing them with the resources, training, and opportunities to thrive. Within months, the foundation became a reality. Victor poured his energy and resources into building a network of programs that identified gifted children in the arts, sciences, and athletics, offering them scholarships, mentorship, and a chance to break free from the constraints of poverty. He enlisted Eliza as the face of the foundation, her story serving as an inspiration to donors and beneficiaries alike. At public events, she spoke with quiet conviction about the importance of believing in the potential of every child, her words often bringing audiences to tears. Eliza, too, had grown into her own. Her once hidden talent blossomed into something extraordinary, earning her invitations to perform at some of the world's most prestigious concert halls. Critics marveled at her ability to convey raw emotion through her music, calling her performances transformative and transcendent. But for all her success, Eliza remained grounded. She never forgot the long days spent playing at the train station or the love and support she had received from the orphanage that had raised her. In interviews, she always spoke of Victor, describing him not just as her uncle, but as the person who had given her a second chance at life. "He didn't just save the orphanage," she once said during a live television appearance. "He saved me, and he didn't have to. That's what makes it so special." Victor, watching from the audience, had to wipe away a tear at her words. He had attended every major performance, sitting quietly in the back and watching her rise to fame. He was proud, not just of her accomplishments, but of the woman she had become, strong, compassionate, and determined to make a difference. As Eliza's star rose, she used her platform to advocate for underprivileged children, partnering with the Harrington Foundation to expand its reach. She performed benefit concerts to raise funds, spoke at schools and community centers, and shared her own story of resilience and hope. "Every child deserves a chance," she would say, her voice steady and clear. "Every child deserves someone who believes in them." Years later, Victor stood on the steps of a new community arts center bearing Eliza's name, the Eliza Harrington Center for the Arts. He had spent the past decade ensuring that children from all walks of life would have access to the tools they needed to pursue their dreams. Eliza, now in her 20s and a globally celebrated pianist, stood beside him, her arm looped through his. She had insisted that the center carry her name, but she made it clear that it was as much Victor's legacy as hers. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Eliza addressed the crowd. "When I was a little girl," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I used to think the only way to survive was to play my heart out for strangers at a train station. I never imagined that one day I'd be here, surrounded by people who believe in the power of music and the potential of every child. None of this would have been possible without my uncle. He believed in me when I couldn't see a future for myself, and that belief changed everything. Now, it's my turn to pay it forward." The audience erupted in applause, and Victor felt a deep sense of fulfillment he had never known in all his years of building empires. He looked at Eliza, her face glowing with confidence and gratitude, and felt a surge of pride. She was more than a pianist, more than a niece. She was the embodiment of everything he had once overlooked in his pursuit of success. She was the second chance he hadn't realized he needed. As the ceremony ended, Victor and Eliza walked together through the halls of the Arts Center, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. The sound reminded him of the first time he had heard her play, of the haunting melody that had drawn him back to a train station he would have otherwise left behind. He smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Uncle Victor," Eliza said, breaking the silence, "do you think Daniel and Mom would be proud?" Victor stopped, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Eliza," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "they would be more than proud. They would be in awe of you just like I am." Eliza smiled, her unseeing eyes glistening. "Then I guess we've done okay, haven't we?" Victor chuckled softly. "More than okay." Together, they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the city. It was a new beginning for both of them, a future shaped not by regret, but by hope, love, and the shared belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives.